When the sun rises over the city, it reveals two different worlds sharing the same land but never truly meeting. High above, glass towers shine like mirrors of success, reflecting wealth, power, and ambition. But down below, in the dusty streets, life moves slowly with struggle in every step. Workers rush past each other, vendors shout softly to survive, and children play beside roads that never promise them anything. It is said in old tales that a city divided in its heart can never find true peace, no matter how tall its buildings grow. At the edge of this shining city stands a great mansion, known by many but understood by none. Its gates are strong, its walls are high, and its beauty is admired from outside. Yet inside, there is no laughter that stays, no warmth that lingers. Servants move carefully like shadows, speaking in whispers, afraid to disturb the silence that rules every corner. Even the clocks seem louder than the people, as if time itself feels unwelcome in the house of power. Amina lives and works within these walls, though she does not truly belong to them. She is young, humble, and steady in her ways, carrying herself with quiet dignity. Every morning she wakes before the sun, remembering her village where respect was taught like prayer and hard work was seen as honor. She does not complain, even when her body grows tired, because her heart believes that patience is a form of strength. In her silence lives a dream she has never spoken aloud. Kofi Adewale, the master of the house, is a man whose name carries weight in every corner of the city. People speak his name carefully, as if it might hear them and judge their words. He believes the world bends toward those who have power, and he has never learned to bow to anything except his own ambition. In his presence, even strong men lower their voices. Yet behind his control lies a distance that keeps him far from warmth, as if wealth has built a wall around his heart. Far away in memory and spirit, Amina often returns to the teachings of her village, where elders speak slowly and truth is treated like sacred fire. She remembers Mama Saad, an old woman whose words always carried weight, saying that life tests those who walk quietly but observe deeply. In the village, people believed that silence could either protect a person or imprison them, depending on how it was used. These thoughts stay with Amina like a guiding light in a place that feels too cold to understand her. In the same world of glitter and power stands Nola, a woman who walks with confidence shaped by status and appearance. She is admired wherever she goes, not for kindness, but for the influence she carries. In her eyes, success is something visible, something measured by wealth and position. She looks at life as a ladder that must be climbed without looking back. Yet where Amina carries sincerity, Nola carries ambition, and between them lies a silent difference that no words can easily close. Night wrapped the mansion in deep silence, the kind of silence that feels alive and watching. Inside, the air was heavy, and every step echoed like a warning. Amina entered with lowered eyes, carrying her duty as always, her hand steady even though her heart was not. Kofi sat in the dim light, unmoving, his presence filling the room like a storm that had not yet spoken. He looked at her for a long moment, and in that silence, something unspoken shifted between power and vulnerability. Amina tried to leave after placing the tray, but his voice stopped her. "Stay," he said, calm but firm. She froze and replied softly, "Yes, sir." In that moment, there was no equality, only the old truth spoken in African tales, that when power stands before silence, silence often has no choice but to bend. What happened afterward was never spoken of, but the house seemed to carry it in its walls. Even the wind outside felt different that night, as if it had witnessed something it could not forget. Days passed, and Amina felt a change growing inside her, slow at first, then undeniable. Fear entered her heart, not only for herself but for what the world would say. She sat alone behind the servants' quarters, her hands trembling as she whispered, "If this is truth, why does it feel like punishment?" Mama Sada's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that truth always walks its own path, even when fear tries to hide it. Amina closed her eyes, torn between shame and a fragile hope she could not explain. When she finally stood before Kofi, her voice was soft but steady. "I am carrying your child," she said. Kofi's expression turned cold, as if her words had no meaning. "That is impossible," he replied sharply. Amina stepped forward, tears in her eyes, and said, "It is the truth. I have no reason to lie." But pride had already closed his ears, and anger rose where understanding should have been. Kofi's voice hardened. "You are trying to trap me with lies. Know your place." Amina shook her head, her voice breaking. I do not want your wealth. I only want truth." But he did not listen. Instead, he called the guards and ordered her removal. Amina was dragged through the halls she once cleaned with care, her voice lost in the cold air. The mansion watched her fall into silence, as if erasing her presence had always been easy. Outside the gates, she was thrown onto the dusty road like something unwanted. The gates closed behind her with finality, and no one spoke against it. In African tales, it is said that injustice often survives not only through power, but through silence. The workers stood far away, watching with lowered eyes, afraid to speak, afraid to become the next shadow. Amina lay on the ground for a moment, then slowly rose, her hand resting on her stomach. The city continued its life above her, bright and careless, as if nothing had changed. She whispered into the wind, "Even if the world forgets me, I will not forget myself." And with that quiet promise, she took her first step into a future that had already begun to rewrite her destiny. The long road back to the village stretched like a memory that did not want to end. Amina walked slowly, her feet heavy, her heart even heavier. Each step felt like the ground was reminding her of everything she had lost. The wind blew softly, but to her it felt like whispers of judgment following her. She kept her head down, holding her stomach as if protecting something precious from a world that had already turned away from her. As she entered the village, voices began to rise like smoke in the air. Women gathered near water pots, men paused their work, and children stared without understanding. Whispers spread quickly, turning into stories that grew sharper with every mouth that spoke them. "That is her, the one from the city," someone said quietly. Another voice replied, "They say she returned in shame." Amina heard everything, but she did not answer. In her heart, she remembered an old saying that rumors travel faster than truth, but truth arrives stronger in the end. Her family met her at the compound, their faces filled not with comfort, but with concern for their name. Her uncle looked at her sharply and asked, "What have you brought back with you?" Her aunt avoided her eyes, speaking instead of neighbors and respect. "Do you know what people are saying?" she asked. Amina tried to speak, but her voice broke before words could form. It was clear that their fear of shame was heavier than their concern for her pain. Questions came like stones thrown without mercy. "Who is the father?" one relative asked. "Why are you alone?" another demanded. Amina stood silent, tears falling without control. Each question cut deeper than the last, as if they were trying to understand her suffering without offering her kindness. She finally whispered, "I do not need judgment. I need understanding." But even her words felt small against their anger and disappointment. When she could no longer stand the weight of their rejection, she turned away and walked to the edge of the village. There lived Mama Saad, an old woman known for her wisdom and quiet strength. Her small hut stood like a place where broken hearts could breathe again. When Mama Saad saw Amina, she did not ask questions. She simply opened her arms and said, "Come, child. Pain does not need permission to be healed here." Amina collapsed into her embrace, finally allowing herself to cry. Mama Saad gently stroked her back and said, "In this life, truth is like a river. It may be blocked, but it will always find its way." Amina listened quietly, her breathing slowing as the old woman's words settled into her heart. Mama Saad continued, "Those who rush to judge forget that even the earth hides seeds before they grow into trees." Days passed, and Amina slowly began to regain strength under Mama Saada's care. One evening, as the sun set in warm orange light, Mama Saad placed a hand on Amina's shoulder and said, "This child is not a curse. Every life comes with a purpose written before birth. You may not see it now, but destiny does not make mistakes." Amina looked down at her stomach, her tears softer this time, not of shame but of uncertain hope. For the first time since her return, something inside her shifted. The pain was still there, but beside it now lived a small, quiet belief that her story was not over. And in that silence, the village outside continued to speak, unaware that within Amina's broken heart, a new beginning was slowly taking shape. Days passed, and life did not become easier for Amina. Hunger became a silent companion, following her everywhere like a shadow that never left. Her body grew weaker, but she continued to work where she could, cleaning, helping, and carrying small burdens just to survive. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, yet she refused to stop. In her heart, She kept telling herself that even broken paths can still lead forward. One afternoon, as she rested briefly under a tree, an older woman from the village looked at her with pity and said, "Child, why do you push yourself so hard in this condition?" Amina lowered her eyes and replied softly, "If I stop, I will fall into despair. I choose work over silence." The woman sighed, understanding that some pain cannot be removed, only carried. Despite everything, Amina never allowed bitterness to take root in her heart. When people spoke harshly or avoided her, she did not curse them. Instead, she would quietly say, "A wounded heart should not create more wounds." Even in suffering, she held on to dignity, as if her silence was a shield protecting her from becoming what others expected her to be. The days began to change with the weather. Heavy winds moved through the village, carrying dust that blurred the sky. Storm clouds gathered without warning, and rain would fall suddenly, then disappear just as quickly. The villagers said the earth itself was unsettled. Amina would sit near the doorway, watching the sky and whispering, "Even the earth is restless, it understands me." The world outside seemed to reflect the storm inside her. Inside her, life continued to grow, and with it came both fear and quiet hope. She often placed her hands on her stomach and whispered, "What are you meant to become in this world?" Some nights she cried from exhaustion, but other nights she felt a strange calm, as if something greater than her pain was forming quietly within her. Mama Saad would remind her, "A burden today can become a blessing tomorrow. Do not speak against what you do not yet understand." Far away from her suffering, Kofi continued his life as if nothing had happened. He moved through his mansion with confidence, believing that the past had been buried with Amina's departure. To him, power meant control, and control meant forgetting. Each morning, he walked with pride, speaking of future success and expansion, never once looking back at the consequences he had left behind. He soon announced his engagement to Nola, a union built not on love, but on status and appearance. At a gathering, he said, "Together, we will build an empire that stands above all others." People applauded, impressed by wealth and influence. Nola smiled beside him, her presence polished and confident, but her eyes revealed ambition more than affection. It was a union of image, not heart, and everyone chose to admire what they saw, not what was missing. Kofi threw himself into his business, expanding his empire with relentless focus. Meetings, deals, and plans filled his days, leaving no space for reflection. He told himself, "The past has no place in the future I am building." But in African tales, it is said that truth does not vanish when ignored, it waits quietly for its return. And as Kofi climbed higher, the shadow of what he denied began to grow silently behind him, unseen but never absent. Kofi's world, once built on confidence and loud success, began to show small cracks that he could no longer ignore. At first, it was nothing serious, an important deal delayed, a contract suddenly rejected, a partner backing out without clear reason. He frowned each time but dismissed it as normal business struggle. Yet deep inside, a strange pattern was forming, as if something unseen was slowly pulling stability away from his hands. One of his managers said carefully, "Sir, clients are becoming difficult. Something feels different lately." Kofi snapped back, "Then work harder. Nothing is wrong with me or my name." But nights brought no peace. When the world fell silent, Kofi's sleep was broken by dreams that felt too real to escape. He would see Amina standing far away, her face calm but her eyes heavy with unanswered pain. Sometimes the ground beneath him would crack in those dreams, swallowing everything he had built. He would wake up sweating, gripping his bedsheets, whispering, "It is just stress, nothing more." Yet his heart beat like it knew a truth his mind refused to accept. Inside his mansion, peace slowly disappeared. Conversations with Nola became sharp, filled with impatience and silence. Servants moved carefully, afraid of his sudden anger. Even the air in the house felt heavier, like laughter had forgotten the way back. Nola once said softly, "This house does not feel like a home anymore." Kofi replied coldly, "A home is built with success, not feelings." But even as he said it, he felt the emptiness growing around him like a quiet storm. Far from the city, the elders of the village began to speak in low, serious tones. Sitting under the ancient tree, one elder shook his head and said, "When a man breaks another life and refuses to see it, the earth itself remembers." Another elder added, "The balance has been disturbed. Something walks without peace." Mama Saad, listening quietly, whispered, "Truth that is buried does not die. It waits in silence." Their words carried the weight of tradition, as if the ancestors were speaking through them. But Kofi rejected all warnings, even the ones that came through silence and dreams. When a close advisor suggested he reflect on recent changes, he stood up angrily and said, "I am not cursed. I am building an empire." He refused to look back, refusing to see that pride had already begun to tighten its grip around him. In African tales, it is said that a man who closes his ears to wisdom will one day hear only regret. Still, Kofi chose denial, believing strength meant never admitting fault. Far away, Amina's struggle reached its most painful moment. The night of her child's birth arrived like a storm that would not soften. The pain came suddenly, sharp and overwhelming, forcing her to the ground as Mama Saad rushed to help her. The wind howled outside, shaking the small hut, as if nature itself was witnessing her endurance. Mama Saad held her firmly and said, "Breathe, child, life is fighting to come through you." Amina cried out, her voice breaking through the night, but she refused to give up, even when her strength seemed to disappear. After hours that felt endless, silence finally fell. A small cry broke through the darkness, soft but powerful. Amina collapsed back, exhausted and trembling, tears rolling down her face. Mama Saad lifted the child gently and said, "This one has come through struggle, just like the mother." The baby did not cry for long. Instead, it became still, watching the world with an unusual calmness, as if it already understood more than it should. Amina looked at her child and whispered, "What are you, my little one?" And in that quiet moment, destiny shifted again, marking the beginning of something no one could yet understand. Mama Saad held the newborn close for a long moment, her old eyes narrowing as if she was seeing beyond the physical world. The firelight in the hut flickered softly, and she whispered with deep certainty, "This child is not ordinary. I see a path written before his steps even touch the ground." Amina, weak but alert, looked up and asked, "What do you mean, Mama Saad?" The elder replied slowly, "This is a child of destiny. Where others fall into silence, he will bring truth without speaking." Amina's heart trembled, not with fear, but with a strange sense of hope she had not felt in a long time. As morning came, Mama Saad carried the child outside, and something unusual happened. The wind, which had been harsh for days, softened as if listening. She said to the gathering few villagers nearby, "Do not look at this child as you look at others. Some lives are not explained, they are revealed." The villagers exchanged confused looks, but the tone of her voice carried weight that could not be ignored. It was not just a statement, it felt like a warning wrapped in wisdom. Slowly, the village began to change its gaze. The same people who once whispered shame when Amina passed now looked at her with uncertainty, even curiosity. One woman admitted quietly, "Maybe we judged too quickly." Another said, "There is something calm about that child. It disturbs me in a strange way." Amina noticed these changes but said nothing. She simply walked with her child, carrying both pain and new strength in her steps. The child, still too young to speak or understand, seemed to carry a quiet presence that made people pause. When he was brought outside, even loud children became silent for a moment. An old man said softly, "Some children cry for attention, but this one, he watches like he is remembering something." His words spread through the village, and slowly, respect began to grow in places where mockery once lived. There was something about the child's silence that felt heavier than words. He did not cry often, but when he looked at people, it was as if he saw through them. Mama Saad once said, "In African wisdom, innocence can be stronger than judgment. A child like this carries truth without needing to speak it." And so, unknowingly, the child became a mirror that reflected honesty in every heart that approached him. Far away, in the city, Nola's life began to shift in ways she did not expect. At first, she ignored Kofi's growing distance, but soon his anger, silence, and restlessness became impossible to overlook. One evening she said carefully, "Kofi, you are not the same man I agreed to marry." Kofi replied coldly, "I am becoming stronger. That is all." But Nola's eyes narrowed slightly, doubt creeping in where trust once lived. She whispered later to herself, "Or are you becoming something I cannot follow?" In the circles where Kofi once received praise, whispers began to grow. A business associate leaned toward another and said, Have you noticed his deals are failing more often? Another replied, Yes, and he seems distracted, almost disturbed. The image of perfection that once surrounded Kofi was beginning to crack in public spaces. Yet he continued to smile in meetings, pretending nothing was wrong, even as his world quietly shifted beneath him. Despite his wealth, Kofi found no peace. His mansion was full, his name still respected, but his heart felt strangely empty. At night, he would sit alone and stare at nothing, as if waiting for something he could not name. He once muttered, I have everything, so why do I feel like I have nothing? But there was no answer, only silence pressing back at him like an unseen force. Back in the village, Amina's story began to rise in a different way. People who once avoided her now greeted her with respect. She was asked for help, for advice, even for healing words. An elder woman said, You survived what would have broken many. That kind of strength is not common. Amina simply replied, I did not choose strength, life chose it for me. And with each passing day, her pain was slowly transforming into quiet recognition, as if the village itself was finally learning how to see her truth. Amina was no longer the woman the village once whispered about in shame. Time, struggle, and endurance had reshaped her into something stronger. When she walked through the village now, people no longer looked away. They looked at her in silence, as if trying to understand how pain had turned into quiet strength. Mama Saad once said, A river that survives the storm does not need to shout to prove its power. Amina had become that river, calm, steady, and unbreakable. One afternoon, a young woman whispered to another, Is that the same Amina we once mocked? The other replied softly, No, that woman carries something different now. Even her silence speaks. Amina heard them but did not respond. She simply adjusted the cloth on her child and walked forward with dignity. In her heart, there was no need for revenge or pride. Only survival had taught her how to stand without breaking. In the city, Kofi's world still glittered with wealth, but it no longer felt complete. At the same time, Amina's life, though simple and painful, carried a kind of honor that could not be bought. The difference between them became clearer with each passing day. One lived surrounded by noise but felt empty inside. The other lived in hardship but carried peace within her chest. An old trader once said, Wealth without peace is just a loud emptiness. But even poverty, when walked with truth, becomes dignity. Mama Saad often spoke in proverbs when she watched Amina. Two paths can look different, she said, but the ancestors always see where they lead. Amina would listen quietly, holding her child closer, as if sensing that her life and Kofi's were still connected by something unseen. The village itself began to feel like it was waiting for something unfinished to return. Far away, an elder who had traveled between villages sat under a tree and spoke in a low voice, A man can run from land, from people, even from memory, but he cannot run from his own blood. Those who heard him fell silent. His words carried weight, as if they were not just advice but a warning written by tradition itself. Mama Saad, upon hearing this, closed her eyes and said, Truth always walks slowly, but it never forgets its destination. In the city, subtle changes began to appear around Kofi's life. Conversations would stop when he entered a room. Partners who once praised him now watched him carefully. A name that once brought confidence now carried quiet uncertainty. Yet Kofi remained unaware, convincing himself that everything was still under control. But in African tales, it is said that shadows grow longest just before the sun begins to fall. Even his own thoughts began to shift in strange ways. Sometimes he would pause in the middle of speaking, as if he had forgotten what he was about to say. At night, he would stare at the ceiling, feeling an unknown pressure in his chest. But he pushed it away, saying, I have no time for weakness. Still, silence around him was no longer empty, it felt like it was waiting. Back in the village, Mama Saad noticed something different in the air. She sat quietly one evening and said to herself, The drum does not beat without reason. When silence becomes heavy, it means the storm is learning how to speak. Amina looked at her and asked, What storm, Mama Saad? The elder only replied, The one that has been walking toward us for a long time. And somewhere far away, preparations for a grand celebration were already unfolding. A stage of wealth, pride, and public honor was being built, unaware that beneath its beauty, truth was quietly finding its way forward. The village square was filled with music, laughter, and the sound of celebration, but all of it shifted the moment Amina appeared at the edge of the gathering. She did not announce herself. She did not rush. She simply walked in with calm steps, holding her child close. Her presence was quiet, yet it carried a weight that made nearby voices slow down. It was as if the air itself had paused to watch her. One woman whispered, "Why does it feel like the celebration has changed?" Another replied, "Because something unfinished has returned." Amina stood there without fear, her eyes steady, her posture strong. The same people who once saw her as broken now struggled to look away. There was no anger in her face, only calm strength shaped by pain. Mama Saad once said, "A storm does not need noise to be powerful." And Amina was that storm, silent but impossible to ignore, moving through a place that did not know how to receive her return. Beside her, the child stood quietly, holding on to her cloth. He did not cry or hide. He simply looked around with calm eyes, as if observing a world he already understood. The child's innocence stood in sharp contrast to the tension rising in the crowd. An old man watching from a distance murmured, "Some children enter a place like wind. You cannot stop them, you can only feel their truth." As Amina stepped further into the gathering, whispers began to spread like fire through dry grass. At first, it was confusion. Then recognition. "Is that not Amina?" someone asked. Another voice answered quickly, "Yes, the one who left in shame." But now the tone had changed. There was shock, curiosity, and unease mixed together. People leaned closer, trying to understand why she had returned, and why she looked so different from the story they once believed. In the center of the gathering, Kofi finally noticed her. His laughter stopped mid-sentence. His face tightened as if something cold had touched him. For a moment, he did not move. Then anger rose quickly in his chest, like a shield built to protect him from fear. "Remove her from here," he said sharply to those around him. "This is not the place for disturbance." But his voice carried something deeper than authority. It carried panic. Nola looked at him carefully and whispered, "Why are you afraid of her?" Amina did not speak. She only stood still, allowing the moment to unfold on its own. The child, however, slowly turned his head toward Kofi. The crowd noticed the resemblance before words could form. It was unmistakable. The same eyes, the same structure, even the same quiet intensity. A woman gasped, "They look the same." Another stepped back, covering her mouth. The truth that had been buried for years now stood openly in the light, shaking even those who once refused to believe. The child, as if drawn by something natural, took a small step forward. He reached out his hand toward Kofi without hesitation, as children do when they recognize something familiar. The movement was simple, innocent, but it struck the crowd with unexpected force. Kofi froze. He could not speak, could not move, as if the gesture had broken through every wall he had built. Mama Sada's voice echoed in memory, "Truth does not knock loudly. Sometimes it simply reaches out its hand." At that moment, the elders of the village slowly stepped forward. Their presence changed the energy in the square. Conversations died down completely. One elder raised his hand and said firmly, "Silence." His voice was not loud, but it carried authority shaped by generations. Another elder looked at Kofi and said, "What stands before you is not rumor. It is truth returning to its place." An elder woman stepped forward next and spoke with deep calm, "In our land, a child is never a mistake to be hidden. A child is life itself, and life must always be honored." She looked at the crowd and continued, "We do not measure truth by wealth or pride. We measure it by what cannot be denied." The words settled heavily over everyone present, as if the ancestors themselves were listening. Kofi stood frozen, caught between pride and collapse. Amina finally lifted her eyes toward him, not with hatred, but with a calm that cut deeper than anger. The child remained between them, silent but present, as if holding two worlds together in a truth that could no longer be avoided. And in that moment, the celebration that once filled the air felt like it had reached its final breath, waiting for what would come next. The crowd stood frozen as truth settled over the gathering like dust after a storm. What began as a celebration had now turned into a moment of deep moral reckoning. No one spoke at first, because the air itself felt heavy, as if the ancestors were present, watching every breath. Mama Sada's voice broke the silence softly, When truth arrives, even pride must lower its head. The words struck deep, and people began to understand that this was no longer about reputation, it was about justice. Kofi stood at the center, but he no longer felt like the man in control. His confidence, once loud and unshaken, began to crack from within. His hands trembled slightly as he looked around and saw faces that no longer admired him. The crowd was still, but their silence was no longer respectful, it was piercing. Nola stepped back slowly, whispering, "What have you brought upon yourself?" Kofi tried to respond, but his voice failed him for the first time in years. The same people who once praised his success now looked at him with doubt and disappointment. An elder who once called him a rising star now shook his head slowly and said, "Power built without truth will always collapse in time." Murmurs spread quietly. "We never knew this side of him," someone said. Another added, "Or maybe we refused to see it." The admiration that once surrounded Kofi was now replaced by judgment, not spoken loudly, but felt deeply. Inside him, something heavier was rising. It was not anger this time, but guilt. Memories he had buried began to surface, Amina's silence, her pain, the choices he refused to face. He clenched his jaw, trying to push it away, but it kept returning like a shadow that refused to leave. "I did what I had to do," he whispered to himself, but even those words sounded weak inside his own heart. For the first time, he could not escape himself. A deep stillness fell over the crowd. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the world was waiting for what would happen next. No one moved. No one interrupted. It was the kind of silence that speaks louder than any voice. In that silence, truth stood alone, no longer hidden, no longer delayed. Mama Saad closed her eyes and said, "Now the truth speaks for itself." And everyone understood that something irreversible had already begun. Kofi's status, his wealth, and his influence no longer held power in this moment. They were like empty symbols standing in front of something stronger. The presence of truth had stripped away all illusion. Even those who feared him before now saw him only as a man exposed to his own actions. An elder spoke firmly, "No title can protect a man from what is right." Those words settled like final judgment over the gathering. When the crowd slowly began to disperse, Kofi remained standing alone. The noise was gone, but the weight remained. He looked around and saw emptiness where admiration once lived. For the first time, he was not surrounded by wealth or power, but by silence, and that silence was heavier than anything he had ever carried. Mama Sada's earlier words echoed in his mind, "A man cannot outrun what he creates." In that quiet space, something inside him began to break. It was not loud or dramatic. It was slow, deep, and painful. Pride, which had protected him for so long, finally fell under the weight of guilt. He sank into himself, whispering, "What have I done? Not for the crowd, not for image, but for his own soul." And in that moment, the story of power and pride ended, making way for something far more difficult, the beginning of truth within himself. Amina stood quietly in the same village that once judged her, but something inside her had changed forever. There was no anger in her eyes, no desire for revenge. When people passed by and looked at her with shame or curiosity, she simply lowered her gaze with calm respect and continued her work. Mama Saad once said, "A heart that refuses bitterness is stronger than a warrior's blade." Amina had chosen that strength, even when pain still lived inside her. One afternoon, a woman whispered, "How can she remain so calm after everything?" Another replied, "Because not every wound needs anger to heal." Amina heard them but did not react. Her silence was not weakness, it was control. In that silence, she carried dignity like a crown no one could take from her. Slowly, the same village that once called her broken now began to see her as someone different, someone reborn through endurance. Kofi, on the other hand, was no longer the same man who once stood above all without fear. For the first time, he walked a road filled with regret. He came forward quietly, no longer surrounded by pride or influence. Standing before Amina, he said with a low voice, "I have come to face what I avoided for too long. I was wrong." His words were heavy, shaped by shame. The crowd nearby watched in silence, waiting to see if forgiveness would be given or denied. Amina looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was steady, not angry, not soft. Then she replied, "Acknowledging truth is not the same as repairing it. Kofi lowered his head, understanding that regret alone cannot erase the past. He whispered, "I only ask for a chance to make things right." But Amina shook her head gently. "Some paths cannot return to where they began," she said. And in that moment, she chose herself over pain, walking forward with her child, leaving behind what once broke her. The village and even the distant city began to reflect on everything that had happened. People spoke in quiet tones, saying, "Truth cannot stay hidden forever." Others added, "What is buried in silence will always rise one day." The story of Amina and Kofi traveled like wind, teaching those who listened that life always balances itself in ways no one can control. The lesson settled deeply in every heart that heard it. An elder in the village summed it simply, saying, "Wealth without honor is like a tree without roots. It will fall when storms come." These words spread beyond the village, echoing across families and generations. People began to see power differently. No longer as something to admire blindly, but something that must carry responsibility. The tale itself became a lesson carried by time. The child born from two broken paths grew quietly, often watching the world with calm eyes. People began to say, "He belongs to both strength and struggle." Some called him a bridge between worlds, because through him, two divided lives were now connected forever. Mama Saad once said, "Some children are not just born into life, they are born into purpose." And so, the child became a living symbol of unity, carrying the memory of pain but also the promise of peace. His presence reminded everyone that even broken stories can lead to healing. And in that quiet truth, the future found its beginning.